Thank you, and good afternoon. It's our pleasure to present to you today the outcomes of the Papyrus Project, which was carried out between 2022 and 2024 at the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden. Over the past 200 years, the collection had received considerable attention in the areas of conservation and restoration, but had never been studied with a holistic approach. The project allowed for a comprehensive study of the entire papyrus collection, which resulted in a detailed understanding of the current condition and providing valuable insights into the museum's conservation history. The combination of these findings formed a foundation on which a sustainable conservation strategy could be developed. Papyrus was produced in the region of the Nile Delta from the pith of the papyrus plant. Although it is sometimes described as the earliest form of paper, its structure is in fact very different. Unlike paper, which is made from pulp, papyrus is made from by cutting the stems of the plant into strips, and they were then soaked and placed together with a slight overlap. A second layer was then applied to the first one, perpendicular to the first layer, and they were beaten and pressed together to form sheets. These sheets were then joined to create rolls that were used as a writing support. It remains unclear whether an adhesive was used between the layers of papyrus or that the naturally occurring sugars in the plant provided sufficient adhesive strength between the layers. But it is precisely this layered structure that requires extra attention when looking for suitable storage methods and conservation techniques. The museum acquired its first papyri in 1826, which is almost 10 years after the museum was founded. Today, the papyrus collection consists of 774 inventory numbers and even a higher number of fragments, which makes it the largest collection in the Netherlands. The history of collecting and preserving papyrus in the museum extends almost 2 centuries. Over this period, a wide variety of framing, housing, and restoration techniques were used, reflecting the knowledge and materials available at the time, and of which you can see some examples on the slides. Although written documentation of these practices is limited, a close study of the objects and their storage conditions revealed certain patterns in materials and techniques. The project consisted of 3 main components and some sub-projects. First, we undertook a comprehensive inventory in which each object was described in detail and its condition documented. Second, we reviewed the storage and housing methods of the collection to determine whether improvements could be made. The third component consisted of several conservation treatments of objects that were either requested for exhibitions or for other research projects. In addition to these main activities, there were several sub-projects, sometimes initiated by other ongoing projects in the museum. A very crucial part, of course, of the project was documentation. In this case, the entire project was documented in written and in photographic form, and all the acquired knowledge was compiled in a report proposing 3 conservation scenarios for the future. In order to write a suitable and realistic plan for the papyrus collection, we first needed quantitative data. Numbers help to classify the collection, for example, according to materiality, condition, housing type, and previous treatments. To obtain these numbers, the inventory was divided into separate sections. The first focusing on appearance of the objects and their housing, such as the size of the fragment, whether or not it contained a collasis which is the border between 2 sheets, if the papyrus only contained text or also illustrations, and if there were signs of old repairs. After the general description of the object, the condition was described for both the object and its housing. The last section of the inventory was used for a conservation proposal consisting of a rehousing or not and a treatment including time estimates per object. There are several ways in which an inventory can be designed. Of course, a checkbox system is a very fast way and very efficient, but the information can also be limited and may therefore be incomplete. Because there was enough time available for this project, it was decided to describe each component in writing. However, there was still a need for consistency in the way things were described in order to properly compare the results. Therefore, sufficient terminology was crucial. This proved to be one of the difficulties of the project because papyrus conservation is not a very widespread specialization within our field, and the terminology in some areas is therefore still incomplete. We initially based our terminology on the Advanced Papyrological Information System, written by Leila Laulan, and supplemented it where it was inadequate for our collection. So for certain features, we made new terms, proposed new terms, and we took photos to illustrate those features. The basics of the collection are overall well described and catalogued, so for the general description of the object, the results were to be expected. However, the section about the previous repairs gave some striking results. More than 90% of the papyri had undergone some form of treatment in the past, far more than we initially expected. These treatments could be grouped into 7 subcategories based on the type of treatment or materials used. Many objects contained multiple types of treatments. Lining of the papyrus, either with a transparent paper or with a white lining, was far off the most common treatment. And as you can see, almost half of the collection received a white paper lining. Furthermore, we were able to identify 8 different types of housing within the collection, varying from cardboard folders to glass plates and cigarette boxes. Even without existing documentation, it was still possible to establish certain patterns in the housing methods and the repair techniques. Thus, even without precise dates, we were able to reconstruct a rough timeline of the museum's housing and restoration history based on the materials used and the order in which they were applied. By combining the quantitative data with more general observation, it was even possible to rediscover things that are already lost. An example of this is a housing method for which no physical copy has survived, but that we have come to call in the museum the accordion method. Many of the longer papyrus scrolls, such as the Books of the Dead, were in the 19th century cut into separate sheets to enable handling and storage, and this resulted in straight cutting lines on the edges of the papyrus sheets. In some cases, however, as you can see on the slide, we also see these cuts in the middle of some sheets, and you can see them where the red arrows point to, the white line, which indicate that these papyri were cut multiple times. Looking at the verso of these cuts, I hope it is visible on the slide, we see textile strips adhered along the cuts. The folding patterns and buildup of dirt within these folds indicate that the textile strips functioned as a hinge and that the longer papyri were presumably stored, folded, a bit like an accordion. An archival note by a photographer confirmed this assumption. He describes how a papyrus of considerable length had been folded and stored in a book-shaped folder with one end adhered to the folder. It is to be expected that it concerns the brown speckled cardboard folders that of which we have a lot in the collection, and now often contain glass-framed papyri hinged to the inside, but which also show a lot of traces of reuse. Combining these different types of information, so the quantitative data and the general observations, gave us a much deeper understanding of how the collection was perceived and used and perceived in the past. On to the damage. Papyrus is a very delicate material. To this, we must add the wear and tear during its time of origin, centuries in the ground, transportation to institutions, often in completely different climates, and then decades of handling and display in cultural institutions. All these factors have contributed to a wide range of damage visible in many papyrus collections. Some deterioration is the result of natural aging or biological degradation, but in the Leiden collection, much is also legacy of earlier treatments, even though carried out with the best intentions at the time. As mentioned before, lining and consolidations were treatments frequently carried out in the museum. On the slide you see an example, a close-up of a papyrus that is lined with a transparent paper, so therefore, you have that shiny layer. The effects of these treatments are significant. For one, the papyri resemble almost placements, stiff with a glossy surface, and this not only alters the way in which we perceive the objects, it also complicates the analysis of materials, for example. Furthermore, the effects on the structure of the papyrus are currently the main conservation issues in the collection. The combination of the thicker lining with the surface consolidation creates tensions that lead to deformations which are clearly visible in raking light. Eventually, these deformations often result in tears in the much thinner papyrus. The lining can also form a problem regarding the layered structure of the papyrus sheets. The layer of papyrus that is adhered to the backing paper is fixated, but the top layer can shrink and expand, which it will when housed in an uncontrolled environment or when treated with a thick consolidation layer, as often happened in the collection. When this happens, the top layer of papyrus splits from its bottom layer because the adhesion between the papyrus layers is weaker than the adhesion of the glue that is used to adhere the lining. This results in delamination and flaking of the surface, which is visible in 46% of the museum's collection, ranging from moderate to severe forms. And here you can see a quite severe form of flaking. To plan effectively for the future, it was not enough to simply record the type of damage. We needed to distinguish between the severity of the damage and the urgency of treatment. For this purpose, we established 4 levels of damage and 4 levels of priority. It is possible that these categories are, for the same object, far apart. For instance, faded ink can be considered severe damage, as there is loss of information. However, it can still be classified as a low priority because the process is irreversible and will not worsen rapidly as long as the papyrus is stored in a stable condition. The result of this classification system, as illustrated in the pie chart, showed that nearly half of the collection falls into the highest priority level. At first, this might seem alarming. However, the context of these numbers is important, as the housing conditions, for example, were also included in this assessment, as poor housing can significantly increase the priority for treatment, but does not necessarily say anything about the condition of the object itself. The results gained from the inventory made it possible to highlight the problematic areas within the collection. As mentioned earlier, 3 scenarios were proposed, offering various options regarding the future management and conservation of the papyrus collection. The scenarios address different aspects and levels of preservation and conservation and include time estimates and associated costs, enabling for a targeted conservation strategy for the future.
As Goliva just showed, the inventory gave us a clearer view of the papyrus collection, not only its physical condition, but also its long history of restoration. But for me, the inventory did more than provide data. It made me rethink our broader strategy as conservators, not only in terms of what treatments are needed, but also how we argue for and structure this work within our institutions. Conservation is not only about ethics and materials, it's also about planning, politics, and priorities. The inventory gave us a solid foundation to argue for sustainable long-term care. By documenting condition, storage, past interventions for every object, we created an evidence-based framework. That framework guides treatment decisions, and just as important, it helps us justify for resources. One key lesson is that conservation planning works best when it's divided into manageable, well-defined sub-projects. Instead of seeking time and funding for the whole collection, we now focus on smaller, targeted efforts. These might be a group of papyri with broken glass plates, or specific issues such as acidic boards or the so-called mini papyri. These focus projects are easier to explain, to manage, and to complete. Their goals and outputs are tangible. That makes them more convincing for decision makers who are not conservation specialists. So the inventory supports more than material care. It has become a strategic tool. It helps us move from reactive conservation to proactive planning, and it signals to the institution that this collection deserves long-term investment, not just one-off treatments. But to plan responsible for the future, we must reflect on the past. Much of the conservation history of our papyri dates back to the 19th and 20th century, and at that time the main concern was stabilize and protect. This was done with the best intentions, but it was done with methods which raise concerns today. Strong and thick layers of adhesives, thick paper linings, and heavy patching. Over time, these materials have discolored, stiffened, or delaminated, and in some cases they obscure text or create mechanical stress. In 1853, the museum proudly reported that for the safekeeping and exhibition of one of the most important classes of objects, the rich papyrus collection, an eminently suitable gallery was built and furnished. This papyrus gallery shows how much time, money, and attention the museum invested in these manuscripts. A few decades later, in 1879, the annual report stressed how vulnerable the papyri were. It noted that the papyrus collection, more than any other class of objects, required constant supervision and care. As the fragile surfaces flaked and broke away, not only were the images and characters lost, but the very methods of protection, such as mounting the sheets on cardboard and consolidating them with glue, often had a negative effect on their long-term clarity or legibility. Even these adhesives did not always hold, as the past here showed. This reflects a period when visibility and stabilization were closely linked, but also when the limits of those methods were becoming apparent. The attempt to secure the papyri with strong supports and adhesives made sense at the time, yet it also introduced new risks. In our current work, our primary task is often to remove our older repairs. Many of these old repairs no longer serve their purpose and in fact obscure. By carefully undoing these layers, we not only stabilize the object, but also reveal more of its material and visual integrity. By the turn of the century, the situation seemed to improve. The annual report of 1900 noted, of the previously so harmful variable atmospheric conditions which had affected the papyri, nothing now can be observed, since these precious pieces are either exhibited behind glass or stored in book form. This shows how exhibition and storage practices were evolving, with measures taken to shield the papyri from environmental fluctuations. Even if imperfect, it was a significant step towards the preventive mindset we recognize today. The contrast with today is striking. Early repairs often used heavy paper, multiple layers, and covered far more than the actual damage. The approach was stabilize broadly, use robust materials, and make sure the object could withstand poor conditions. Today, our repairs are much more local and much lighter. We use extremely thin Japanese paper, and we keep the interventions as small as possible. Instead of reinforcing large zones, we touch only what is truly unstable or vulnerable. The footprint of our repairs has shrunk dramatically. Why is that? Is it simply because our materials and adhesives are better now, or has our whole mind set shifted? I think it's both. Certainly, we have access to more suitable materials, but we have also developed a different relationship with the object. We no longer assume it needs to be held together tightly. In many cases, we can trust the integrity of the papyrus itself, its fibers, its original construction, its ability to endure. We assume fragility less quickly than before. The storage conditions also play a role. Today, the papyri live in climate-controlled, low-light rooms with strict handling rules. That security allows us to repair more lightly. In the 19th century, when storage was less stable and long-term preservation less predictable, heavy reinforcements made sense. Stronger materials and larger repairs reflect the risk as they were perceived at the time. This shift tells us something deeper about conservation. It is not only about better tools. It is also about how we see our role. We have moved from being protectors and stabilizers to becoming partners of the object. We respond to it rather than impose on it. So how do we respond to this legacy? How do we evaluate the work of past conservators with a critical eye without reducing their efforts to mere mistakes? Conservation is never neutral. It is always shaped by cultural values and by assumptions about what matters, what should be preserved, and how. What we now call best practice will also change. Our priorities, reversibility, retreatability, minimal intervention, are not timeless truths. They are part of our current framework. This is why in our current work we document and study older restorations carefully, rather than simply remove them. In some cases we preserve small parts of earlier repairs because they tell us something about the treatment history. That history is part of the object's biography. Without it, our understanding of the object and our responsibility to it would be incomplete. This brings me to a final point, and one that is especially relevant among colleagues. Our own interventions are now becoming part of the object story. Just as we reflect on the work of our predecessors, future conservators will reflect on ours. That might feel daunting, but it should not. We work with care, we document thoroughly, we think critically, we act with the best intentions and with the scientific knowledge and tools available to us. That does not mean our decisions are perfect, but they are considered. Yet, after more than a century, it is time to ask what kind of attention this collection deserves today. In the 19th century, the papyri could be presented as the pride of the institution, and resources were channeled accordingly. Today, it is harder to argue for that focus. The work of the conservator is no longer limited to repair. It also involves curing, research, exhibition work, preventive care, and daily management of storage and display. At the same time, the institution's priorities have also broadened, shifting from a narrow focus on scholarship and collection care to include visited numbers, income, marketing, and fundraising. This raises a critical question: should this collection still be at the center of attention? Thanks to past interventions, the papyri are in reasonable condition and basic care standards are met. Institutional focus today lies more with registration, accountability, and public visibility than with single collection campaigns. This tension is exactly why reflecting on the past matters. It reminds us that the papyri once were considered central to the museum's identity. Whether they should hold their position again is open to debate, but by recognizing them both as ancient manuscripts and as witnesses of 2 centuries of conservation practice, we remind ourselves why reflecting on the past is crucial to shaping the future of our field. Thank you.